Greetings, magical mavens. It's Afura here, a witch of Hedge, Hearth, and Harvest. And in today's video, I am finally responding to a video tag from the Wild Witch on my Apothecary. Fun story. Months ago now, I think it was like late summer, early fall, I was busy preserving the harvest of my herbs in my kitchen, and on the YouTube account that I use to watch videos, which is my original account, The Writing Witch, a video popped up by the Wild Witch, and it was her apothecary tour. Now, I had never heard of her before, had never seen her channel, and I don't honestly even normally click on things like witchy videos. Honestly, I tend to watch YouTube videos that are not strictly witchy related because I have a lot of other interests. And so it was kind of interesting that not only that video popped up, but I also was in the mood to actually watch something like that. So I clicked on it. I really found it interesting. She was talking all about the things that she keeps in her apothecary. And it just so happened that I listened all the way to the end of the video, and I mean the very end of the video, where she tagged a bunch of accounts, and the very last account that she tagged was my new channel. It was so just weirdly ironic and fitting because I'm a human design projector, which means that I try to respond to invitations instead of just randomly doing things because my energy works more efficiently when I'm actually responding to an invitation. So as I was watching the video, I was thinking, wow, it would be really fun to do a video like this, but you know, no one's tagged me and I have so much other stuff to do, so I don't really have a reason to add this to my project list right now. But at that exact moment, she tagged me. And I was also shocked because like this channel is still very new. I started it less than a year ago, and at the time I'd only posted like a couple of videos on here so far. And so for someone to have not only found the channel, but also taken the time to watch my videos and be curious about my green witchy practice enough to tag me in a video, I just want to say thank you so much to the Wild Witch for inviting me to do this. And here we are. Now, it was months ago when I was tagged in this because, as I mentioned, I have just been so busy. Like, I moved into this new house. I had a lot of things that I needed to do when I moved in to make it my own. Obviously, starting a big outdoor garden in a strange environment for the first time, not to mention just a lot of life stuff going on, and starting a whole new YouTube channel while still having to keep up with my business and my old channel. So I really wanted to get to this video a lot sooner. I wanted to get to it during harvest season as opposed to right now in December, but actually I think it's pretty fitting because for those of you guys who are big into gardening or foraging or both, fall is a really busy time, and as a professional like online witchy person, fall is also a really busy time for my business as well and just my personal life. So it makes sense that now that I'm really wanting to slow down, sit down inside, relax, and just catch up, I think that's actually the perfect time to kind of talk about what's going on in my apothecary now that it's actually full and pretty much complete. So I thought, what better way to sort of kick off my next phase of this channel than to cozy up with a nice warm beverage and do this apothecary tour now that it is snowy and freezing outside and there is nothing left to forage. And actually, because I tend to be a little bit extra, I've actually decided to sort of turn this into not just a video, but a series, because just like I said, with so much going on for the past few months and being so busy, it unfortunately kind of turned into a thing where I was very behind in editing and producing the content that I was filming during the harvest season. So if you follow the channel, you know that I just recently, about a month ago now, got around to posting the garden transformation video and my sort of beginning of my foraging journey in my new environment. And I really wished that I would have been able to start posting that kind of content earlier, but since I was out there doing it all the time, my days basically looked like my sister, who walks her dog every day, would see something that she thought I would want to forage, We would go foraging for a few hours. I would come home, have to preserve and or plant the things that I foraged, and then with whatever time I had left in the day, I had to like get up into my office / studio and just get work done for my career, because it's hard to balance having so many different interests. And unfortunately, editing videos was just something I didn't have a lot of time to do, especially because when I did have to make time for editing videos, it needed to be my seasonal series on my other channel. So I'm not sure if you guys watch my other channel. It's been around for over 10 years now, actually. And it's mostly about seasonal living for witchy and magical people. And it's very much based around journal prompts. And so I have been loving doing that for a long time. But this past year, part of the reason why I started this new channel is because I have really been feeling called by, you know, the universe to branch out and do something different, something that feels more fun and relevant to me right now, as opposed to just the same sort of stuff that I've been doing for a long time. And so I am actually kind of for the first time announcing here, I guess, even though this is a new channel and not the old one, you guys heard it here first. I am not doing another like rigid information-based seasonal series on my other channel after this current one is done. The last video for this current series should be done in the late winter, a little bit before the spring equinox. And I'm gonna still keep the channel up because there's a lot of great content on there. A lot of you guys found me over there, and I'm always probably gonna want to have a place to post informational content about seasonal magical living and things like that. But I'm not locking myself into these series where I'm stuck having to create these highly produced videos that take a super long time and effort to create, that really don't leave a lot of room in my life to just kind of go with the flow and do what I love. Not that I don't love that, but there's just so many other things that I love, and it's time for me to do things a little bit differently. I'm going to be starting a new series on this channel that I'm going to be hopefully putting a lot more of my energy into, and being able to have it more seasonally relevant, as opposed to staying stuck in this pattern of just having to like catch up with whatever I didn't get to share earlier when I was too busy to do so. That being said, some of you guys really have been asking to see my harvest season, how my whole gardening season went, what I was able to forage in the late summer and into the fall. And don't worry, I have every intention of showing that to you. In fact, I was going to post some of that as my very next video. It's actually almost done being edited right now, but I just felt like, especially once it finally snowed here just this week, I was like, you know what, dude, I just don't feel right posting what would be a July vlog in December. I feel like it needs to be tied into the current season somehow, so it doesn't feel so just behind the times. And so I was thinking, like, how can I still share that content but bring it up to date in a way, and also be leaning into my projectorness and actually be responding to invitations instead of just doing stuff, you know, throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. And I thought, what if I actually combined the intention of showing my harvesting process with this invitation to talk more about what's going on in my apothecary? What better way than to show you what is currently in the apothecary and then do some flashbacks to show you how I harvested it and preserved it and or gardened it. So that is exactly what I'm going to be doing starting in the next video. In this video, I'm just going to be responding to the list of questions from the tag video. And then for the next one, we're going to be digging a little bit deeper and taking a closer look at the things that are currently in my apothecary that I gardened or foraged or preserved during the summer. And I'll actually show you the footage of how I did that. Let me know if you like this idea. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into these questions for our introduction to my apothecary series. So I went ahead and printed out the questions. This tag was originally created by a channel called Pagan Crafting, and I was tagged by the Wild Witch. So she created this list of questions all about what is in our apothecary. And pay attention to these questions if you are feeling inspired by this video, because I am going to tag, just like the Wild Witch did, everyone who was watching this video, and then also stay tuned to the end because I want to tag some specific people as well. So question number 1, origins of the collection. What inspired you to start collecting apothecary items, and how did you begin your collection? I haven't always been such a green witch, and in fact, I specifically remember about 3 years ago now, I was talking to my partner about some herb or plant that I thought could help him or someone he knew with something they were going through. And I found myself kind of like inserting this little disclaimer of, oh, I'm not much of a green witch, or I'm not much of an herbal witch, I think was the word that I used. And I kind of had to stop myself and be like, is that actually true? And if so, why or why not? And the fact is, the reason why I was saying that about myself is because at the time, I did not have a ton of traditional knowledge about either the medicinal or the magical uses of plants. I had some that I had picked up along the way, as many of us do. I had been practicing in this sort of witchy sphere for going on 10 years at the time, definitely about 10 years now. And so of course there were some things that I had kind of picked up on, but I had never been someone who like really read a lot of books specifically on that, or like retained a lot of the supposedly standard information about that. But what I had to realize at that moment was like, I actually do have a very strong relationship with plants. It's just in my own way. And so I guess if we wanted to go all the way back to like the very origin of it, I have been kind of interested in and occasionally collecting and using for various things for my entire life. You know, many of us were that little kid who was outside in the yard picking flowers and making weird little potions, or using them in craft projects and things like that. But if we want to get a little bit more specific, I would say that it really started sort of when my magical path started, which was about 10 years ago now, in my early to mid 20s. And it mainly kind of happened starting in the fall time, of course, because fall is my personal summer, as it's called in the celestial alchemy astrology method, which is my friend and colleague Tanae Stewart's astrology method. She's my astrology mentor. And if that's something you're interested in, I will link a video to figure out like what your personal seasons are, because that can be super interesting. But I digress. Fall is my time. It's a time when I get very excited and I start to connect with my true nature more, and just nature in general. And so I was kind of having a difficult time in my life. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to be doing, and I happened to look at the calendar and see that it was the autumn equinox. And I was like, there's definitely magical significance to this. And so I started diving deeper into learning more about seasonal living and seasonal magic, and kind of the rest is history, I want to say. But one of the first things that I did when I realized that this sort of seasonal magical living thing very much resonated with just who I was even when I was a kid, and that I needed to kind of bring that back into my life, was I went outside and I started picking stuff up. I went out and grabbed the, acorns and chestnuts and colorful leaves and all of that kind of stuff. And I started not just decorating with it, but also kind of creating intentions with it, and kind of like making little talisman type things, and just using it with a little bit more intention. So I'm going to say that that's where my practice like started. But fast forward all the way up to like a couple of years ago, as I was saying, when it occurred to me that I had been telling myself that I wasn't very herbal, when the fact was I was, and I also wanted to become more of an herbal person. So at that point, I set the intention that I was going to get out in nature more again, just start interacting with the wild world around me, and start actively both learning the traditional meanings and uses of things, and also better understanding and documenting my own connection with certain plants. And so I'm going to say that it really started about 2 or 3 years ago. I'm bad with time. I don't know if it was 2 or 3 years ago. That was when I started actively in my adult life getting into gardening again, foraging a lot more than I ever had before, and really starting to build up a collection of things that I could use in my life and practice. So it was at that point that I started actively reading about both the medicinal and the more like woo-woo purposes for plants. And honestly, my sort of method with that is really to learn about how these plants were used medicinally as well as in folklore, as opposed to just reading those like classic witchy books that just list a bunch of correspondences. Because honestly, part of the reason why in the past I felt like I wasn't connecting to that is because it's too generic for me, and a lot of the time they don't explain where they're getting that information from or why I should listen to it, and that doesn't work for me. Part of the reason why I thought that I was not so much of a green witch is because my strongest astrology signs, as in like my sun sign and my rising sign, are in air signs. And so before I learned a lot about my astrology, I thought like, oh, I'm an air witch. Of course, that means I'm into art and writing and intellectualism and journaling and stuff like that. But I also always really only felt healthy and well when I was living seasonally and making time to connect with nature. And so when I learned more about my chart, I realized that I actually have a Capricorn stellium as well as my Jupiter and Mars in Taurus, which means that I actually do have a lot of earth in my chart as well. And so when I learned that, I was like, dude, that makes sense, because at the time when I had really been focusing on the more airy and fiery parts of my chart, just because that's what I thought was more prominent, I was struggling with the earth element. I was struggling with money. I was struggling with feeling grounded and safe. And I really needed to get grounded. And so I actively started focusing more on plants and the earth. I started wearing more green and decorating with more green, going out more, bringing plants in more, reading about the medicinal and nutritional and folkloric traditions of plants, and a little bit of the more traditional witchy stuff here and there, of course. And I really kind of found my home in that. And so hence, eventually I started this new channel where I can really focus on that kind of stuff. So that being said, there was also the fact that I needed to change my entire sort of life in order to sort of really get grounded and connected with the earth element again, and that involved moving. So if you caught the first couple of videos on this channel where I was sort of introducing who I am and why I'm doing this and how I got here, about a year ago exactly, I moved into a new place where I am much closer to nature, and I have a big yard and I can garden and I can forage on a regular basis. And in the past, that was not the case. For many years, I was living in city apartments with just a patio. A lot of the time I wasn't even very close to any really naturey areas, and I just felt really ungrounded and disconnected from nature. My official like collecting of what you're gonna see in here really just started a few months ago. And one of the main reasons for that is because even though I did kind of start getting into foraging at my old place, I was, first of all, just learning about a lot of plants. And so when you're first starting, you don't necessarily want to be going out and over harvesting things that you don't even know if you're going to use it. You know what I mean? So it's better to kind of just take small amounts and experiment here and there. So I only had like small little containers or made small tinctures or oils or things like that that I kind of then used up. And then since I did end up deciding I just needed to move and change my life, I also didn't want to be actively collecting a bunch of big jars of things, because then I was going to have to move with that stuff. So I made sure that I was moving as minimally as possible with the intention of then becoming more of a maximalist once I had moved. And so most of what you're going to see here has actually been harvested just this past growing season, but there are definitely things in there that I've had a longer history with that plant. So we'll be getting into each of those individual things as the series progresses. So the next question is about storage. what do you use, and any special significance behind your choices. Like most people whose videos I've watched on this tag so far, I primarily store in glass jars. Just like most people said, you know, plastic is just evil. I realize there are some good uses for plastic, but you know, being someone who tries to be eco-friendly in general, I have mostly a hate relationship with plastic. And so I just don't really want a lot of it around me in the first place. I don't want to be actively collecting it unless, of course, you know, it happens to come into my life unintentionally, as plastic tends to do. But also glass is just, it's healthier for us. It doesn't leach chemicals into the things we have stored in them. And I even heard Kara, who started this tag, say that she believes that plastic like sucks the magic out of things. Now, I don't know if I believe that literally in it, but energetically, yeah, plastic is not magical. Let's be real here. Glass is made of a natural material. It's ultimately biodegradable and much less harmful to the environment, but also it just has like a much more ancient history, and it feels more like I'm connecting to nature and the ancestors when I'm working with glass. Something about the way the glass clinks together just sounds so beautiful and magical to me, and you just don't get that with plastic. Also, glass is just, on a practical standpoint, it's something that's easy to collect, because if we buy, you know, sauce jars and, you know, things like that, we can very easily collect a lot of glass without necessarily having to go out and buy it. I think that's pretty much the standard answer when it comes to storage. That being said, I do not have a lot of rhyme and reason right now to the way my things are stored. They're in all different recycled glass bottles of all different shapes and sizes right now. The most standard thing that I have in there is like regular canning jars, just because I have also gotten into actual canning in the past few years, and so I tend to have more ball jars handy, and so sometimes I end up storing my dry goods in there as well. And question number 3 is about labeling. What do you use as your labels? What is your process in labeling? And what do you write on your labels? Now, I have sort of 2 different answers right now. My most cutesy and magical answer is that I like to print out these little labels that I created a few years ago. I like to print them out on like a cute old-fashioned looking paper, and I like to use my scripty writing to write on it what it is. However, most of what is in this cabinet does not have labels like that right now. Mostly it is just my kitchen herbs that have those kinds of labels, because a year or 2 ago, when I was sort of re-energizing my kitchen, I got rid of all of the plastic containers, put everything in glass containers, and added cute little labels to them to sort of spruce up the magical energy in my kitchen. Because for me, obviously we're in the kitchen. My apothecary is in the kitchen here. Thankfully, that was also another thing that was sort of a non-negotiable for me when I was looking for a new place to live, was I needed enough room in the kitchen that I could also have my apothecary in here as well. Because for me, those 2 things go very hand in hand. One of the reasons, again, why I used to think I'm not much of like an herbal person is actually because, even more so than like herbal magic and herbal like medicinal remedies, my connection with plants very much is in the kitchen. I am kind of a kitchen witch, and I love cooking and eating and gardening edible things and foraging edible things. And so I like to pay attention to the potential magical correspondences of things that I'm actually just eating. So for me, the apothecary and the herb shelf are kind of interchangeable. There are certain things that are more so of a tea, or more medicinal, or more for magical use, as opposed to I have over here certain things that are very much just being thrown into cooking recipes a lot more often. But a lot of those things are the same things, you know? So that being said, this cabinet does not have fancy labels, and the reason is simply because I have not gotten around to it yet. As I mentioned, I have just been actively harvesting and foraging and gardening and all of that kind of stuff, and just simply getting the things into jars so that they're safe. And I have not had time to do any fancy labeling. If that's something you guys would like to see me do in a video, please do share the invitation in the comments to do that, and I will make sure that I bring that into the series. But ideally I would have cute little like old-fashioned, old-timey looking labels on everything. In real life, a lot of things are just my scripty handwriting saying simply what it is with a Sharpie on the glass or on the lid of the jar if it's a canning jar. So one thing that a lot of people said in this tag was that they like to put things like planetary or gender correspondences of things and stuff like that. I do not put that on mine. While I do love that idea, and I think that's a fun way to kind of remember what your correspondences are if you're someone that's into that, that isn't anywhere near as relevant to me personally. And there's a few reasons for that. Reason number one is because, like I said, a lot of what I do is like just sort of kitchen witchery, where I'm going by how I feel about that herb and how I think it's going to taste in a recipe and how I think it's just going to mingle with the energies of my intentions, more so than needing to know the like traditional meanings and correspondences of things. I am an Aquarius, and the archetype of Aquarius is the rebel. And so it's not that I have a total disregard for tradition. I find traditions so fascinating. Like my other channel is very much talking about things that I've learned about traditions. However, when it comes to my actual practice, I'm more about forming my own traditions and not necessarily caring too much or worrying too much about what the quote unquote right and wrong way to do things is, or the traditional categorization of things. So while I do find that stuff interesting, especially again, going back to the celestial astrology method with my friend Tanae Stewart, she actually recently, not even recently, now it was like 2 years ago, put out a book called The Modern Witch's Guide to Natural Magic. I'll insert a picture of the book here, but she came on my podcast and I asked her, I was like, so I totally get the whole like cyclical and astrology stuff, and I love plants, but I've never understood how they're connected and why people tend to slap these astrological labels onto plants. Like, what is that? And she actually explained it really well. She did insert the disclaimer that to some extent you do just need to go with your intuition because that's going to be way more relevant for you. But she also provided a very like pretty solid explanation of why we have some of these more traditional correspondences, which I thought was actually really cool. So since then I have gotten a little bit more into it just on an interest standpoint, but when it really comes down to my just everyday authentic practice of what I'm really doing, that stuff just is not as relevant to me. When I'm thinking about correspondences, it's usually more going to be an elemental standpoint, and a lot of what Tanae talks about in her book and her podcast does resonate with me. Not all of it, but a lot of it. But for me, it's more so just like looking at the herb and feeling into like, okay, what element does this represent for me right now? And going with that. So I don't really need to have it written down. I don't really have a desire for that. But if you do, that is really cool. And I just want to say, like, I'm not bashing anyone that does that, because I think one of the most important things about the witchy community is that we all have our own little specialties and do things in our own different ways and are more excited about certain traditions over others and things like that. And I love that diversity. But for me, all I have written on my jars is what they are. And I think it is so important to make sure that you do write down what it is. The folks that I follow on the more medicinal as opposed to witchy path when it comes to herbs, they kind of have this ongoing joke of like, you always think that you're going to remember what you put in that glass jar. You can see it, you can smell it, you think you're going to remember what's in there. But as your practice grows, you're going to realize that certain things look and smell similar, or maybe the color will fade over time and it won't quite look the same as it did anymore, and you might forget what was in there. And I have actually had that happen a few times now. And so I think the most important thing is to simply write it down. Another thing that's more from the medicinal side is folks usually say to write down the date that you harvested it. And while I do think that from a practical standpoint that is helpful to know, just so you know like how old something is, if you might want to replace it, things like that. I don't always do that, mainly because the way that I work with things, I'm not too worried about how fresh it is. I will be able to kind of have an idea of how long I've had something. If I get like a fresh new crop of something and I want to compost the old one, I can do that at whatever point. But I'm also someone that if it's an herb that I'm actively using up, I'm just going to basically dump out the older stuff, put it in a bowl, put the newer stuff at the bottom of the jar, and then put the older stuff on top so that the older stuff keeps getting rotated out sooner. But I'm never gonna be able to fully know exactly when all of it was harvested if I'm doing it that way. That's one of those do as I say, not as I do things. Like, I do think putting a date would be helpful, but I don't usually do it just for personal reasons. Now, the one exception to that with the dates though is if you are doing an actual herbal preparation that can potentially spoil. So for example, if you are making an herbal oil, especially, oils can go rancid. And so you do want to have a better idea, especially if you are still brewing that oil and there's still plant matter in there, and especially if that plant matter was fresh as opposed to dried. You do want to have a pretty good idea of when you started that, because if you leave the herbs in for too long, that can cause it to go rancid sooner, and you just don't necessarily want to keep an herbal oil for a super duper long time in any case. So that is one where I would definitely say add the date to that. But even for things like tinctures that are made in alcohol, those have a pretty much indefinite shelf life. So while I do think it's helpful to add dates to things like that, it's not quite as necessary. So question number 5 is historical significance. What are some of the most historically significant pieces in your collection? And can you share any interesting stories behind them? Historical as in like history of the plant itself in the world. I think every plant is historical. Just about every plant that we would ever use medicinally or magically or even culinarily has its own history with humans, and I find that stuff to be so interesting. However, what's more relevant to me is like personal history. And I think the Wild Witch mentioned that too. She mentioned that she has a jar of the hair of her pet that passed away. And I have things like that too. I don't know if I necessarily consider it apothecary, because for me, apothecary is more like plants, whereas in the other room on my like witchy altar area, I have more what I consider spell ingredients that are not necessarily botanical. So much like the Wild Witch, I do have a jar of whiskers and claws from almost every cat that I have ever had. But for me, that's something a little bit different. So as far as botanicals with personal history, I am going to just use a very simple example of mint. I actually talked about this in a video on my other channel. Me and mint go way back, like way before I knew, to call myself a witch or an herbalist or any of that kind of stuff. When I was a kid, I just had a relationship with mint, and when my dad passed last year, it also occurred to me that in part, mint kind of represents my dad for me now as well. So when we were kids, my dad purchased a property out in the country that we would go and spend some time in sort of like a camping type capacity. We had always intended to actually like build out the beat up trailer that we had up there and actually turn it into something where we could stay there if we wanted to, but we never got to that point and eventually ended up having to sell the property in order to buy a better house and some rental properties in the city. But it was just a way for us to really connect with nature in a way that we never got to do living in the city. And I remember one of the first things that we noticed that was a recognizable, like edible plant was mint. So one of the times we arrived there and the ground outside of the trailer was just very overgrown and very hard to navigate through. And so my dad mowed the lawn. And as he was mowing, we could smell this really strong smell that smelled like mint. And so after he was done mowing, we went looking around, and surely enough, there was wild mint growing. And as we got the bonfire started for the night, we then were able to relax with a cup of fresh mint tea. That's kind of what's interesting about mint, is that on the one hand, mint is this very like zingy and energizing, almost exciting type of energy, and like refreshing and renewing, but at the same time, it can also help you to relax. And that's kind of two very different things that somehow are mushed together with mint. And that kind of almost reminds me of the experience with my dad, where like he was showing us like you gotta, do the work to get things done and then you relax afterwards. And that mint kind of represented both of those things at the same time. Another thing with mint is that even years later, after we no longer had that property, unfortunately, mint ended up just creeping back into our lives many times. So many years later, when we bought our suburban house that was a little bit outside of the city and had more yard space, my mom started doing some actual gardening for the first time, and she planted a little potted mint plant. And she even, bless her heart, tried to do the right thing with the mint and put it in a pot instead of in the ground. But surely enough, that mint found its way out of the pot and into the ground. And even once she had tried to pull that mint up, years later, you would still find mint popping up all around the yard, nowhere near where it was planted, even growing out of cracks in the sidewalk and the blacktop of the driveway. Years and years later, after my parents divorced and moved to different places, I moved back into that house for a little over a year, and that was when I had first kind of really started my magical practice, and I really wanted to experience gardening myself for the first time. And mint was one of those things that I immediately found again and reconnected with and started using, also more in a magical sense. And again, instead of just looking up like what is the magical significance of mint, for me, I would use it in spells and rituals that were related to longevity and like groundedness and perseverance, I think is the main word that I would use for mint, because mint just doesn't care. Like mint will keep growing. It will grow almost anywhere, and it's wild, and it sends out these shoots that grow underground and like create more mint popping up everywhere. So I also put two and two together when I was kind of talking about mint in this green magical video on my other channel last year, thinking about my dad now being, considered an ancestor now that he's passed, and how mint reminded me of him. I'm also realizing that mint kind of reminds me of ancestors in general, in the sense that you can have a mint plant that is like the descendant of another mint plant that was somewhere, who knows where. The parent plant sends out these tubers, and then more mint plants pop up everywhere. And it's like very relentless and hard to stamp out. I also remember some years ago, someone who was my best friend for many years at the time had moved into her father's house as he was getting older, and he, I guess, had done the same mistake that my mom had of planting a little mint plant that got totally out of control, and she wanted to get rid of it. And so one day I went out there and I like pulled up as much of it as I possibly could, and I put a tarp down, and I was like, you've got to make sure that this tarp stays down for like a year so that like the plant dies out. And of course she got busy and didn't take care of it, didn't keep an eye out for it, and of course the mint came completely back by the following year. And actually the jar of dried mint that I had been slowly using for tea for years, up until literally this past spring when I finally used it up, had been some of the harvest from my friends. And what I had kept prior to that had been all of the mint that I could harvest from my old house before I had to move from there. And so mint is one of those things that's just very prolific, and it has a lot of historical meaning to me personally, and it does kind of represent ancestors to me, which kind of ties in with the whole historical aspect as well. So mint is definitely going to be my number one pick. It goes way back for me, and it's kind of the first thing that I've thought of when I thought of herbs for most of my life before I started learning about so many others. And a lot of things are in the mint family, as I've discovered. There's a lot of different kinds of actual things that can be qualified as mint, and then there are other things that we don't necessarily think of as mint that are in fact in the mint family, and they all have kind of similar characteristics, but each one brings a little something of their own to the table as well, which is really cool. Question number 6 is spellcraft integration. How do you incorporate these apothecary items into your spellcraft, and are there any specific items that you find particularly effective? I'm not a huge spellcraft person. That's not to say that I don't do spells, I definitely do. But for me, my practice is much more based around everyday practice and sort of ritualizing the things that I would want to or need to do on a daily basis, more so than like doing actual spells all the time. I tend to do a couple of big spells per year when I really want to change something. And at that time, I will usually just, like I said, intuitively feel into the energies of what I want or need and choose ingredients based on how I'm feeling at the time. But I am actually just going to refer back to the mint thing, especially before I had a huge apothecary and I was just working with like the same 10 herbs all the time for many years. I always go for things like mint, cinnamon, rosemary, sometimes just things like salt and pepper, like literally the stuff that everyone has in their kitchen. Orange peels, things like that, stuff that you can find in your fridge or your spice cabinet that pack a punch, so to say. They have, you know, magical significance that you can read about in books. And so if you're somebody who's flicking through a book and you're doing a spell, there are a lot of spells that will call for just really simple things that everyone has. And I think there's a lot of value in that simplicity and that accessibility without making things too complicated. But also for me, since I have so much experience with some of those more basic things, it also makes sense to me that those are the things I reach for on a consistent basis because I've had so much experience with it. So mint and cinnamon, for example, they have like a lot of power and potency. Their smell very much reminds me of certain energies. And you know how they say smell is one of the most powerful senses that we can evoke. So yeah, I say go for the tried and true familiar things for you, whatever those are. And for me, those are a lot of the things that I just find in my kitchen. But that being said, this is kind of a hard question for me to answer because I am one of those people that believes that your intention and your ability to evoke the desired feelings of what you desire and to take aligned actions and inspired actions after doing the ritual is really where the magic happens, way more than what ingredients you choose. And I know that some people are really into their ingredients. I'm really not. For me, it's more about the energy, and the ingredients are more just kind of symbols or things that can kind of boost the energy a little bit. But I think that we could do just as effective spell work with no ingredients as long as we are in the right mindset and we are shifting our own energy. Question number 7 is rare finds. What is the rarest or most unique item in your collection and how did you come across it? Now, I don't know if this is the most rare or most unique, but the very first thing that pops into my mind, sweet woodruff is one that was just one of those weird things that I would hear about on witchy channels, but had never had any personal experience with. And it wasn't really as much from like a spell work standpoint that I wanted to try it, but more so from a culinary and seasonal tradition standpoint. So many of us have heard of sweet woodruff in the context of May wine for Beltane season. And for years, I always wanted to try real May wine, which calls for sweet woodruff. And I had no idea what it was or where to find it. And one thing that you may notice here is that there's not a lot of stuff here that I've had to send away for. I've never been someone who felt that in order to have a legitimate practice, you had to like send away to places like Mountain Rose Herbs or wherever else, or even going to your local witchy store to like buy these exotic herbs that you couldn't just find or grow yourself. Again, not that there's anything wrong with that. If that's your way to do it, that's totally cool. And in fact, when I first started, I really enjoyed watching some channels where people did do that and talked about that because it was just informative and interesting to me. But in my own personal practice, for me, working with plants is very much about finding them and connecting with them either in their natural environment or just happening upon them in some way or being gifted them. Like for me, it's a much more natural process as opposed to like buying things. And so if I'm going to get up close and personal with a plant, it's probably because I happen upon it in some way. And that's how it kind of works its way into my practice. So it was one of those things that I was like, you know, maybe one day I will buy some sweet woodruff just to find out what it's about. But in the meantime, I'm just going to throw mint into my wine because that goes just as well with strawberries, right? But I did want to find out more about it in the back of my mind. I had that intention. And so when I did start really getting into foraging that first year, I started looking around for it because a lot of people mentioned that it, again, was something you could find around May and June, and it was an ingredient for May wine. Lo and behold, I ended up finding it not in May or June, but in September. And I did not find it in most places. I actually ended up finding it in a very specific forest in a local park that is to the south of where I live now, where I hardly ever go anymore. And it happened to just be growing there. I was busy paying attention to like a weird mushroom that I had found, and my partner was like, hey, what is this weird plant over here? And I wouldn't have even noticed it if he hadn't pointed it out. And I pulled out my little phone app and I identified it, and I was like, oh my God, it's sweet woodruff. There wasn't a lot of it that I was able to find at that time, and it's really important to not over harvest things if there's not a lot of it. And since I had never seen it anywhere else, I didn't want to take the risk of over harvesting it and risking it not growing back in that spot. So I just took a little bit, took it home, made a little tincture out of it. At that point, it was September. So I was glad to have learned about tincturing because tinctures last basically forever. And so I figured I'll tincture it, I'll keep it all the way until next spring or summer when I finally get to make that May wine. And at that point, it's basically just like a flavor shot of like herbed liquor that you would throw into the wine. So it was perfect. So I finally got to try it this past summer, and basically it tastes kind of like a combination of like chamomile and vanilla. So if you're unable to find sweet woodruff and you don't want to send away for it and you want to try something that tastes kind of like a traditional May wine, try a combination of those other culinary herbs that you probably already have, because it is very similar. And apparently it's like better for you, because I guess sweet woodruff, if you consume too much of it, is like bad for your liver or something like that. So that's another thing to be aware of. But that was one of those fun finds. And then of course, once I knew where to look for it, I went back again this year, again in the fall, because just since life had been so busy, I had intended to go back in the spring just out of curiosity to see if it was growing in May, but I didn't get around to it because it is like quite a trek from where I live now, and it just didn't end up happening until September again. And this time we found quite a bit growing, and not only did I harvest quite a bit of it to dry, but I also managed to get some up from the root. It's another one of those things that grows through tubers, so I was able to get a few little plants without, you know, upsetting the ecosystem too much. And so I planted some outside under the tree that seemed to have taken well in the early fall. We'll see how it holds up through the winter and the snow. Hopefully it will come back next year. But just to be safe, I do also have some right here on the windowsill that seems to be doing just fine in a pot indoors as well. So that's one of those ones that, again, even though shortly after discovering it that first time, I did end up coming across a relevant reference to it in a spell book. So that did end up being convenient, because for once I did actually want to try a spell from a book, something I don't normally do. But for me, it's more so an exciting culinary and like seasonal tradition type find. Those are the things that get me really excited. My practice is very much based around like kitchen witchery and seasonal traditions and connecting with plants on a seasonal basis and kind of putting intention into my cooking, or into, in this case, an herbed wine. So that one is definitely my prized possession as of late. I feel like for every single one of these questions I'm saying, I'm going to try to keep this short. I don't know how to keep things short. Part of the reason why I don't do much on Instagram and TikTok is because long form content is my jam. I have a lot of thoughts and a lot of things to say. So if you're still here at this point in the video, I want to say thank you for being here. And I am going to try to move as quickly as possible through the next few. So the next one is care and preservation. What steps do you take to preserve and care for your apothecary items, especially the more fragile or older pieces? I mean, I'm not really concerned about like fragile and older pieces. I don't really have anything that's like super rare or irreplaceable or anything like that. For me, it's more so just about learning as I go and learning the like proper preservation tips for dried goods. So for example, and thankfully this is one that is very replaceable that I learned this lesson on, but over the summer, I accidentally ended up with some mold in one of my jars. It was some self-heal, which self-heal is a plant that was one of the first medicinal ones that I happened to discover growing pretty much everywhere, that ended up being really useful for a health concern that I had at the time of the year that I learned about it. So I like to try to keep self-heal on hand through the winter so that I can tincture it and use it for medicinal purposes. But when it is in season, which is basically from like mid-spring up until it snows, so it's not like it would be so hard to replace that, but it was kind of a bummer because I spent the summer every few days I would go out and pick a bit more as the flowers would pop up. I had them drying, sitting out. I'd like sewn them together on a string, and it was like this beautiful garland that was drying for like months and months. And then once it was dry, I went ahead and I put it into a jar. And I don't know if it's because it was humid this summer and maybe it hadn't fully dried or like some moisture had gotten into it, but I think the more likely scenario is because originally the plant that I had sitting out that I put in the jar probably was dry. But then I harvested a few more flowers and I let them sit out for only a few days or a week during humid, like particularly humid times. And I think those were not actually dried out on the inside, and I thought they were. So I put those into the top of the jar with the other ones and the whole thing ended up molding. So that was kind of a lesson. Again, I'm grateful that it wasn't something like that I had to do a big trek for, like the sweet woodruff, for example. But I would say definitely if you're gonna dry things out in the open air, which can be fun, it's a fun sort of traditional way to kind of decorate your kitchen in an authentically witchy way. Just make sure that it really is dry. And if there's any doubt in your mind, go ahead and just, even if it's just when you're getting ready to put it in the jar after it's been sitting out for a long time, just pop it in a really low oven, even if it's just for like an hour, or pop it into your dehydrator. My air fryer has a dehydrate setting and that's what I use. So yeah, if there's any doubt in your mind that there might be moisture in something, definitely just make sure to go that little extra mile to dry it out before putting it away. On that note, of course, in that last segment where I was rambling about rambling, of course I ran out of space on my phone, so if the lighting and everything looks a little bit different, I've just gone ahead and turned on another camera that I don't normally use, just because I do want to get through this before it gets dark, which it's almost winter solstice time, so it's getting dark quickly. So unfortunately we missed the recording of number 9, so I'm gonna jump into number 9. I was just gonna finish up by saying that if you don't want to put your herbs into the oven or the dehydrator, because from a medicinal standpoint, that does just kind of make it a little bit less potent. Another thing you can do is you can just, once it's what you think is fully air dried, you can put it in a jar and just don't seal the lid just yet. If there's any doubt in your mind that there might be a little bit of moisture in there, you can just like put it in your cabinet for a few more days or weeks or whatever. And especially if, like, say it was humid and then the season changes and it's not humid anymore, but you don't want to have it sitting out anymore, that's something you can do. It's really putting the lid on it that ends up like sealing potential moisture in there. So just something to keep in mind. So moving on to question number 9, future additions. Are there any specific items or types of items you are currently searching for to add to your collection? And honestly, I'm gonna be able to wrap this up a little bit more quickly than the rambly versions that accidentally didn't get recorded, but I am actually gonna shift this question towards gratitude as opposed to desire, because if you had asked me this question 6 months ago, I would have had a list for you. However, I have been very blessed that most of the things, or if not all of the things on my list, I have actually found in the wild since I've gotten even more into foraging this year. So for example, something I had always heard was like a miracle herb, especially from a medicinal standpoint, is yarrow. And I had never come across yarrow, at least that I was aware of, until this year when I happened upon some. And now I know of a few different places where I can wild forage yarrow. And of course I also propagated some and I have it growing in my garden. Again, hopefully it will survive the winter. but I do have quite a bit of it dried now as well. Another one is St. John's wort. I had only found a teeny tiny little plant of St. John's wort the first year that I went looking for it for some reason, but my sister has since let me know that on her dog walks she knows of a bunch of places where it grows in epic abundance, and so this year she was able to take me to some of those places and I got an absolute shit ton of it because it really is, I don't know if it's considered invasive exactly, but it is very much taking over certain areas, so that was really nice. And again, I did try to plant some in my garden. I'm not sure if that took, but even if it didn't, I know where to find it now. And obviously the sweet woodruff was one of those ones that like I really was wanting to try, especially after I found that little bit of it the one year, and I was hoping to find a larger harvest of it and or get it growing, which I now have. So, I mean, I guess, for example, there's one thing I can think of, meadowsweet. So I learned about meadowsweet sort of just randomly in passing as I was following some videos that were coming out seasonally on it on the like medicinal channels that I follow. And I remember thinking at the time that it had some medicinal properties that I thought would be helpful for me at the time. And I thought that I found it, but it turned out the type of meadowsweet that I had found around here is actually an American type of meadowsweet that actually doesn't necessarily have the medicinal properties that the ones found in I think Europe and Asia have. And so it's more so of just something that makes a sweet tea, so it wasn't bad that I had harvested some. But yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where when you start getting into the medicinal and I guess even the magical correspondences of plants, you realize that just because a book calls for something or just because you learned about a particular plant, it doesn't mean that you need to get like fad plant mentality and like go through hell and high water to get or purchase or find that one plant. Because for almost every single plant, there's other plants that are more easy for you to access that have very similar properties and will do basically the same thing for you. So I think what ended up happening was I ended up finding that some other plant that was growing in abundance in my area would have helped me with the same concerns that I had with meadowsweet. So, I mean, that's one that I would love to find, but I guess what I'm realizing is that it's not native to my area. I am in a place now where I am more so just grateful to have found a lot of the things on my list, and I'm not like desperate to find anything in particular right now. But as I continue to learn about more plants, I'm sure there will be more things that I'm excited about and that I'll have more stories about going forward. Question number 10 is, what is the most bizarre item in your apothecary collection and how do you use it? I don't know, is there anything bizarre in here? There's definitely some bizarre things that I have in like my just magical witchy home in general, but as far as like my actual apothecary, which like I said, I think of apothecary as like botanicals, I don't think there's anything too bizarre. I'm sorry if that's like a boring answer, but seeing as I rambled about the rest of them, we're just gonna, I guess, skip that one. If you could only keep one ingredient, what would it be? I am gonna actually go with mint because in addition to everything that I said earlier about how it's one of my go-to things for like energetic and symbolic purposes, it also is just a very versatile like plant. You can use it as a seasoning, you can use it as just a tea to enjoy. It has a lot of medicinal properties, not least of all is just like getting rid of stomach ailments and cramps, for example. It can help you with headaches and, you know, all the things that I mentioned as far as like the symbolism that I like to use it for in spell work. So mint for sure. That is hard though. How could you put this question in here, Kara? That is hard. Question 12, advice for new collectors. What advice would you give to someone who is just starting their own apothecary collection? That is an easy one. I would say, first of all, start by learning your own personal connection to any and all plants that you come into contact with. Again, whether you start with kitchen herbs, kind of like I did, realizing like salt and pepper can be used for protection. Rosemary can be used for memory and for like remembering your power or your magic, and everything I said about mint, you know what I mean? So start with the simple things that you can easily access, especially if you're someone that like lives in a city and you haven't gotten to do a lot of foraging yet. Definitely start with things you can get at the grocery store, because they're affordable, they're accessible, and they're powerful. And most importantly, for me at least, you don't have to think of these fancy and outside the box ways to use them. If you simply add them to your spell candles and or add them into your cooking with intention, that in and of itself is really all you need to get started. We don't necessarily need to be doing all these crazy elaborate things or collecting expensive or hard to find items or over harvesting things that might be endangered just to like have it in our apothecary. I mean, I say that as I have like a ton of stuff in my apothecary, some of which I don't use every day, but I just don't want people to think that you have to start with anything that's like over the top. I think the best way to actually learn your personal connection with plants is to observe your personal connection with plants. And another tip, this is kind of like a separate part too, learn about the things that are growing in your environment. As I mentioned, just about everything that I have in my apothecary is something that I harvested myself, either by growing it myself from seed or from a cutting, or things that I literally just got out in nature and discovered. Definitely download a plant identification app. Don't take it like as 100% accurate, because they are not 100% accurate, but it's definitely a great place to start in just starting to get an idea of what plants are and the similarities of certain plant families. For example, when I did identify the sweet woodruff, I immediately thought, this looks a lot like something I've seen everywhere. And so I looked it up, and it turned out that there's another plant in the bedstraw family. I think it's called lady's bedstraw or cleavers, which is also medicinal, but it's in a completely different way. It's in the same family, it has the same leaf shape, but it's like a slightly different color and a different size. And I was like, okay, so bedstraw is very common here, but woodruff is not native and it only grows in certain conditions. You start picking up on and noticing and learning about plants, and you start to build like a mental sort of library of understanding about it. And honestly, while I have no problem with like anyone who wants to buy things that they're unable or unwilling to forage for, I realize foraging isn't for everyone. Not everyone has the accessibility to it. Like you know, you might have health issues that don't allow you to get out in nature as much, or you might just not have local access to a lot of it, which I totally understand that. But if you can, I think it's really great to just like get your butt outside, be out in nature, be experiencing plants, be observing plants, and just start looking around at literally the things you can find outside your door that might be magical or medicinal. And even if you can't find in books about it being magical, ask yourself, what does it mean to you? What does that random weed growing out of the crack in the sidewalk out front of your house make you think of? Does it make you think of resilience? Does it make you think of rebellion? You know, like, what is it for you? So I could go on and make an entire video about that, and in fact I did. So I think I've probably already linked that here in a reference to something else that I said. But yeah, those are my main two tips. Start with things that are accessible and already in your kitchen and see how you can use them with more intention, because those are the things you're actually going to be able to have consistency with and stick to, because you already have a relationship with them. And then when you want to start learning about more stuff and branching out, definitely start with things that are local. Not only is that like better for the environment, with you not having to like send away for things and have them shipped to you, having to spend money, having to be concerned about the ethics of like fair trade and all of that kind of stuff, but also it just gives you an excuse to get outside and genuinely connect with nature, instead of being like a quote unquote, what is it called? Like a living room pagan or whatever, where like, you know, we have this idea of like, oh yeah, I'm part of a nature-based religion, but I never leave my house. You know, like honestly, that was me for a few years. when I was like really focused on other things in my life and wasn't making the time to connect with nature, and it made me very unwell, honestly. And so I'm in a much better place now because I decided I was just going to get out and start learning about and experiencing nature. And so that is my biggest tip. And finally, question 13, curious about fellow creators apothecaries. Who would you tag in this video? So as I said, anyone who is watching this video, I would like to tag you. And I don't even really know how tag videos work, but I think the way that we find each other is you can like post as a video response to this video, and or you would put the hashtag, which I'll be showing on the screen right here, in the title of your video, just like I did here. I think that's how it works. If that's not how it works, I'll insert further information here. But yeah, if you want to respond to this, I would love to see your apothecary. And I would also like to specifically tag Earthseed Detroit. She is one of my favorite go-tos for herbal stuff, and actually I think the way that I really started learning from her is when I started my TikTok. I don't know if she started following me and then I found her, or like a few things were suggested to me. I'm not subscribed to a lot of things on TikTok because I don't really care for TikTok, but when I do go on TikTok just to post something, her things are always the first things that pop up, and she always has great little tips for herbs. And so I've started following her here on YouTube as well. And she just has like really good down-to-earth medicinal and magical advice on how to work with plants. She lives out in the country and she grows her own stuff as well as forages, and I think that's just really cool. So that is my video. If you are still here at this point in the video, I want to say thank you so much, and thank you again to the Wild Witch for tagging me in this. I really appreciate you so much. And I will catch all of you guys in the next series, where we will actually be talking about specific plants, where I found them, how I harvested and preserved them, and how I use them or intend to use them. Thank you so much for being here, and until next time, blessed be.